June 6, 1944, off the coast of Normandy, 12 miles seaward of Arromanches. Salt stung the eyes, and the wind tasted of oil and cordite. The sea itself seemed to be fighting the invasion, rolling in low, leaden waves that slapped the hulls of landing craft and smudged the horizon with a thin, grey smear. On the deck of a lurching LST, Lieutenant Colonel James Hart, Royal Engineers, kept both hands on the rail to stop himself from sliding. His binoculars fogged. Beyond the bow, the shoreline was a ragged line of smoke, sand, and movement. Men below decks cursed softly as engines rolled and steel ramps scraped. Hart had the look of a man who had slept badly for a week and had been handed a problem that smelled of oil and math and blood. Beside him, Petty Officer Samuel "Sam" Turner, a veteran chief petty officer in the Royal Navy, shouted into the wind, his voice stolen by the surf. "Caisson in tow, keep her steady. Don't let her yaw." The tugboats strained like animals on a chain, each one towing a hulking concrete block that for months had been called a phoenix. To any untrained eye, they might have looked like mistake-made islands. Hulks of reinforced concrete, pocked and pale as tombstones, each one tagged with painted letters and numbers that meant little to the men who would soon live or die behind them. On the beach, where the sand rose up like a pale, wounded lung, Captain William Avery of the 531st Engineer Shore Regiment felt the sand crunch beneath his boots as if it were glass. Men in oily life jackets ran by with sledgehammers and steel wedges, their faces set and wet with salt. Half a mile inland, the thud of artillery rattled the air. A Spandau's bark and an 88's retort punctured the world like a clock. Avery checked a clipboard, felt the paper tremble in his hand from the concussion, and looked at the man with him. Sergeant Pritchard, a square-faced Seabee from the U.S. Navy Construction Battalion, who had shaved his head since leaving the Channel and now had salt-caked stubble. Pritchard did not speak often. He had learned in the Pacific and again on this crossing that loud plans were for the planners. Real work happened in whispers, in the grind of a rivet gun, in the smell of hot metal. Above them, RAF fighters hunched low, their black contrails scribbling across the sky like furious pens. The noise was everywhere. Engines, the grunt of landing craft settling onto sand, the tinny clatter of radio sets, the far-off thunder of bombardment from battleships that lay like slow whales offshore. Men coughed and spat and tried to think. Think about where to put a pier when the only available harbor had been locked and mined and held by the enemy for 4 long years. They thought about supplies, ammunition, fuel, food. The iron need of an army that in the first 2 days after the landings would consume everything it had and still beg for more. Without a port, the invasion risked bogging down in mud and blood. This was the question that had followed the planners across the Channel before any troopship left England. How to land the weight of an army when the only usable harbors were still in German hands. The obvious answers, smash a port, seize an existing quay, use the old facilities, fell apart on the map. Cherbourg was a prize, but it lay to the west and would take weeks of operations to capture. Instead, someone in the high rooms of the Combined Operations Headquarters had gone quiet one afternoon and refused to accept obvious failure. Engineers, naval officers, and a handful of obstinate civilians had drafted an idea so audacious it sounded like lunacy. Build a port at sea. The materials that would become the Mulberry Harbors had been born in factories and shipyards across Britain and the United States. At night, on inland rivers and in London docks, men welded, bolted, and painted, constructing floating roadways called whale, massive floating piers known as pierheads, block ships to form a breakwater they called gooseberries, and the giant concrete phoenix caissons, whose hollow bellies could be flooded and sunk to form a seawall. The parts were stranger together than apart. Segmented roadways that would lie on the surface like mechanical eels, floating concrete boxes that once flooded would lie down and say, in effect, here is solid ground. Now, on that chill morning at Arromanches, those plans had come loose from their papers and were on the move. Outwatched as a line of pilots, officers and ratings tasked with shepherding these pieces, signaled with semaphore and shouted into handsets, trying to bring the whole unwieldy machine into place under fire. Men in orange lifebelts guided steel anchors into the seabed, chest deep in water that bit through wool. A German battery inland had seen the incoming flotilla and opened up. Spray rose in columns around the caissons, and splinters rained like a crude kind of confetti. "Hold her steady," Turner yelled as a near miss rocked their LST and sent a spatter of seawater over the rail. The Phoenix, a hulking silhouette, listed and then righted, as if resenting the attempt to bruise it. Hart felt something like a prayer, then realized it was a calculation. Time, tide, tow lines, the angle of attack from shore batteries, and the world reduced itself to numbers and the stubbornness of steel. And elsewhere, on a knoll somewhere behind German lines, an Oberstleutnant in a charcoal-grey greatcoat peered through a brass-rimmed scope at a horizon that did not make sense. There were ships where there were no docks. There were piers that had not existed the day before. For German commanders accustomed to the language of fortified ports and mined harbors, it was an affront to the order they had taken for granted. They barked orders at men who could not answer the question, how do you shell a harbor that is not there until it is? The first pieces were always the riskiest. Men, machines, and ideas met salt water and fire, and one by one, the Mulberries attempted to prove they were more than a blueprint. The wind shifted, engines strained, and in the shallow wash off Arromanches, the first whale roadway creaked under the weight of a Sherman tank being hauled ashore. A tentative iron footfall on a new shore. June 8, 1944. The tide at Arromanches dragged the seaweed low, pulling debris and wreckage toward the half-built wall that now jutted out like the bones of a drowned city. For the men of the Royal Engineers and the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, this stretch of water had become something like an altar. They were building, not merely surviving. Lieutenant Colonel James Hart crouched near a small crane, its treads half submerged in grey water. A cold wind ran through the half-finished causeway and made the cables hum. The massive concrete Phoenix caissons loomed like cliffs, their numbers stenciled in white: PHX 32, PHX 41, PHX 56. Each was the size of a block of flats, and each had been towed hundreds of miles from Britain across a treacherous sea under blackout conditions. Now they were being sunk into position, one by one, with precision that bordered on madness. Sergeant Pritchard, waist-deep in surf, slammed a metal spike into a wooden plank to mark alignment. 6 feet to port, someone shouted. Another voice called back, she's flooding too fast. A muffled explosion inland made a column of sand lift into the air like breath. Still, the work didn't stop. Every few hours, a convoy of smaller vessels approached, tugs dragging fresh components, floating roadways. Whales, their steel joints designed to flex with the tide, snaked through the surf behind them. Men guided them by rope and pole, their uniforms plastered to their skin. The plan was almost unimaginable. When finished, this artificial port, codenamed Mulberry B, would allow thousands of tons of vehicles, fuel and food to roll ashore every single day, without a natural harbor, without dry docks, and under the guns of a determined enemy. Above them, in the smoke-streaked hills, German artillery observers watched the scene unfold through their scopes. Reports filtered back to divisional headquarters near Bayou. Enemy construct structures in open sea. Appears to be harbor works, possibly concrete pontoons or rafts. Cannot determine purpose. Major General Richter of the 716th Infantry Division read the dispatch twice. A harbor impossible. No one builds a harbor in days. And yet on the horizon, the impossible was happening. Back at sea, Royal Navy tugs maneuvered block ships into place for the outer breakwater, a line of obsolete merchant vessels deliberately sunk to calm the surf. They called them the Gud, gooseberriesm. The crews aboard those sacrificial ships waited for the final order to scuttle. Some stood at attention as demolition charges blew, the decks tilting under their boots. A few waved to the engineers watching from the piers before stepping into lifeboats. Within minutes, the ships groaned and rolled, their masts dipping into the water until only their skeletons remained, forming a protective wall that broke the pounding waves. By the third day, the outline of a port had emerged where only ocean had been. Phoenix caissons rose like a grey necklace curving along the coast. Between them, whales connected to floating piers. On those piers, lorries, tanks, and ambulances rolled in a line so steady it seemed unreal. Captain Avery wiped his face with a rag streaked with salt and oil. "We're building London Bridge in reverse," he muttered, watching as a WKW, an amphibious truck, rolled from a floating roadway onto dry sand. Lieutenant Colonel Hart gave a thin smile. "No," he said, his voice lost beneath the wind. "We're building victory." Far inland, German commanders could not make sense of the aerial reconnaissance photos arriving from Luftwaffe units. The black and white prints showed rows of dark rectangles, caissons, linked by lines of lighter tone, the whales. The analysts wrote in pencil across the top margin, unidentified structures, likely temporary jetties, but nothing about them was temporary. Even the storm that lashed Normandy on June 19th would not erase the fact that, for a brief, shining moment, the Allies had rewritten the physics of war logistics. As the engineers drove the last anchor into the seabed that afternoon, a distant thunder rolled from offshore. Not artillery, but the steady beat of engines. A convoy of Liberty ships approached, their holds swollen with supplies. On the bridge of one, a U.S. Navy lieutenant pointed ahead, astonished. "Is that a port?" he asked. The captain, an old merchant mariner who had crossed every ocean on Earth, nodded slowly. "Aye," he said, "and it wasn't there last week." The miracle of Mulberry B had begun, and the German commanders watching from their bunkers could not yet grasp what it meant. That the tide had turned not by blood alone, but by the hands of men who built a harbor out of nothing. June 19th, 1944, 12 days after D-Day, the sea had turned against them. By dawn, the wind howled across the channel with a force that made even the veterans of North Atlantic convoys mutter quiet prayers. Waves slammed against the unfinished harbor at Arromanches, the once sturdy floating piers rising and falling like dying leviathans. Steel moaned, bolts snapped. Somewhere out in the grey blur, a Phoenix caisson tore loose from its anchors, drifting broadside into the surf like a runaway fortress. Lieutenant Colonel Hart had not slept. His eyes were red, his uniform stiff with dried salt. Standing on a slippery pontoon, he gripped a railing that shuddered under each wave. Around him, men shouted through the wind, voices ripped apart by the storm. "The anchors are going. She's breaking free." A crash echoed from the seaward line where the block ships, the gooseberries, were being hammered by the gale. The old vessels, already half sunk, now took the full brunt of the storm. Their steel hulls screamed as the waves smashed through rusted plates. By mid-morning, 3 had broken in half. Their mastheads disappeared into the foam. Further out, on the roadways, the American Seabees worked in pairs, roped together for safety. Sergeant Pritchard was one of them. His boots slipped on the slick steel decking as he tried to secure a floating pontoon to its mooring cable. "If this line goes," he shouted to his partner, "we lose the whole bloody section." His partner, a 20-year-old machinist from Pennsylvania, nodded, teeth clenched, face whipped raw by rain. They drove steel wedges into the shackle while the sea roared up around their knees. By noon, the Mulberry at Omaha, Mulberry AC, was gone. The American harbor, battered by 90-knot winds, was ripped apart piece by piece. Roadways twisted like spaghetti. Caissons cracked and sank. The engineers on shore could only watch, helpless, as weeks of labor vanished beneath the waves. But at Arromanches, Mulberry B, the Royal Engineers and Seabees refused to surrender to the storm. Every hour, men fought to reinforce anchors, lash pontoons, pump out flooded compartments. The air smelled of diesel, rust, and desperation. "We hold this," Hart said hoarsely, "or we lose the war's momentum." Pritchard looked up at him through the rain, jaw set. "Then we hold it, sir." Through that night and into the next day they did. The Mulberry creaked, groaned, and bled, but it did not die. When the storm finally broke and the sea flattened into exhausted ripples, what remained of the harbor was battered but alive. On June 22nd, reconnaissance planes from the Luftwaffe returned to photograph the beaches again. The analysts were dumbfounded. Despite the storm's devastation, they saw trucks unloading cargo, tanks driving off floating causeways, and ships moored in calm water behind the Phoenix Wall. In their report to German High Command, one line stood out: "Enemy port facility remains functional despite severe storm." Believed impossible. At his headquarters near Caen, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel read the report in silence. The sound of Allied artillery rolled faintly from the west. He looked up at the staff officer who'd brought it. "A harbor," Rommel said quietly, "built from nothing. They bring the land with them." He knew then, as did many in the German command, that the invasion was no longer a beachhead to be repelled. It was an unshakable bridge to the continent. Days later, as the first Liberty ship nosed into the newly repaired Mulberry B, its grey hull sliding past the Phoenix caissons, Lieutenant Colonel Hart stood on the pierhead, watching trucks rumble down the floating roadways. Each carried food, fuel, ammunition, life itself for the army pushing inland. Richard climbed up beside him, wiping grime from his hands. "We did it, sir," he said simply. Hart gave a weary nod. The wind was calmer now, and the tide lapped gently against the hulls below. "No," he replied after a moment. "They did it. Every man who refused to say it couldn't be done." The two stood together as the ship's engines rumbled, and behind them the harbor stretched toward the sea. An impossible structure born of human will, forged in salt and steel. To the Germans watching from distant cliffs, it looked like sorcery. To the men who built it, it was proof that courage could be measured not just in battles won, but in bridges and harbors built where none should exist. The Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches would go on to supply over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies in the months that followed. A miracle of engineering, a triumph of will, and for those who first saw it rise from the sea, a reminder that sometimes in war, the impossible simply takes a little longer.